Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Who Am Us Anyway? I'm your host, Azalea Jane. This is the first episode, so I'm going to spend most of it explaining what the purpose of this whole podcast is. In the future, I'm hoping to have co-hosts or guests most of the time, but for this first episode, and maybe a few more, there's a lot I want to get out there to set the stage. This podcast is about the intersection of activism, introspection, and critical thinking. It's about challenging or questioning our beliefs. It's about distinguishing truth from falsehood. It's about improvement on every level, improving individuals, systems, and societies, working toward a better world for everyone, a world with less suffering, less ignorance, more happiness. I'm also going to be weaving my own story in a little bit. I don't want to make this podcast all about me. I want it to be more about the ideas and values I'm putting out there, but at the same time, these ideas are all woven together in my mind for various important reasons. There are several large and encompassing trains of thought that I want to weave into this podcast, and I'm still articulating these a little bit. Train of thought number 1, self-improvement. I also call this inner growth or introspection. Now, I'll say up front, it's easy for this to devolve into narcissism, being out of touch, or being naive, or excessively individualistic. But at best, I think this can be simply about knowing oneself better, addressing and healing wounds, developing empathy for others, developing social skills, learning to process and manage and express one's own emotions healthily, uncovering biases, and so on. It's one of the few values I learned as a child that I still think is really important, although exactly what it is and how I do it has morphed significantly. Some of the things I've done in the vein of self-improvement: I've done a lot of journaling, though very inconsistently, and rereading journal entries can be quite educational. I've been in therapy on and off since about 2004, 4 or so different therapists. I've read quite a lot of self-improvement or similarly introspective or educational books over the years and gleaned a fair amount from different perspectives. I explored several different spiritual groups when I was younger. I was in a 12-step group for a very long time. I actually hope to talk about that more in later episodes. And I have massive criticism of the 12-step model, but I did get some positive things out of it. The focus on community and not shouldering our burdens alone is good for everyone, and the personal moral inventory bit can be very powerful. I've also tried to start a meditation practice several times, but so far I've not quite been able to get in the habit. These are only a handful of methods that one can use to look inside, as it were, and I'm hoping to explore more alternatives and complements to books or therapy or support groups in these episodes. As with anything, there are ways to do introspection constructively, and there are many pitfalls. I want to talk about all of that. Suffice it to say, it's a very broad topic. Train of thought number 2, activism, social change. In addition to self-improvement, I'm also very much into improving society. The society I live in, to put it mildly, is broken. That might not be the right word because it was never fixed to begin with. But either way, I think many of us can agree that the world we live in is extremely dysfunctional. There are egregious human rights violations everywhere, every day. Many or most humans suffer for no good reason, some much more than others. And much of that suffering is, at least in theory, preventable. What actions can we take to help? Where do we put our efforts? What can one person do? Activism is, almost by definition, very obviously political. This is a subject where I've personally morphed a lot in terms of what's important to me, my interpretation of events, what my goals are, and how I spend my energy. Whatever you do as an activist will depend very much on where you stand politically and what's important to you personally. Here's where I can talk a bit about my own politics. It's probably clear from context that you could call me politically progressive. By standards of American politics, you'd probably call me a far-left pinko. It is a little weird to be considered extreme, because at the end of the day, I just want everyone to be happy. I do want to be able to talk with people who have different political interpretations from me, at least to a degree. People who disagree have to talk to each other, at least in certain cases. We have to understand each other to solve any problems we share in a real, lasting way. If you care about the issues, if you care about the evidence, if you care about the consistency and integrity of your position, and you care about the people, and ultimately you're driven by a desire to reduce harm and increase the happiness of our species as a whole, I'm hoping we can find some points of agreement. These two trains of thought, inner and outer improvement, are sometimes pitted against each other. An activist might ask, what's the point of therapy or support groups or whatever when people are dying in the streets? It's one of my main theses that I will come back to frequently, that inner work, especially processing one's own trauma, is invaluable for anyone to be effective doing anything in the long run. Train of thought number 3. Atheism, secularism, cults, science, logic, critical thinking. So I will admit up front, this train of thought is broad and diffuse and will take a little longer to explain. It relates back a lot to the first two topics. There is much atheist activism that seeks to remove church-state violations and call out the religious abuse in the world. Critical thinking is an important part of introspection. It encourages people to be dispassionate about themselves and heavily reduce one's susceptibility to cults and high control groups. Science is routinely undercut by religious and extremist groups, touting ideas that are obviously wrong and harmful. I group these topics together because, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, they're all very related in my mind. I was born into a religious cult, and later, for a little while, joined another. As I deconverted from theism in general, as my beliefs in gods and souls disappeared, I started learning more about science, logic, critical thinking, logical fallacies, and how brains work. Atheism isn't a foregone conclusion after learning about these various things, but it is a common one, and a very understandable one. Like when I truly internalized that, for example, no human can possibly ever be completely sure about anything, I realized that for me, faith is an untenable concept to me and cannot justify anything. Somebody saying they're faithful, at least in a religious context, means nothing to me in terms of what they know about the universe that they share with me. I realized that I didn't have faith, I didn't want faith, and that I couldn't honestly claim to believe in gods anymore. Not knowing and not believing, that meant I was an agnostic atheist, whether I liked it or not. At first I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but now I feel fantastic about it. I'll be talking a bit about this more later in the episode. I want to talk about everything I learned in my deconversion. I want to share what I've learned about what motivates human belief and action, because the more you know about the pitfalls our brains can get into, the better you can avoid them. Recruitment into cults, and this is not just religious cults, but includes things like QAnon and the gender critical movement, is depressingly easy for humans to do. Every human is susceptible to delusion and propaganda. Simply knowing this, and especially knowing how humans become deluded, gives you the best possible chance of avoiding delusion, or finding it in yourself. One of the goals I have for myself and for my listeners is the development of what I'm now calling one's ideological immune system. This is very similar to what Carl Sagan referred to as the baloney detection kit in his book, The Demon Haunted World. It's an excellent book, by the way. Highly recommend it. A very important point I want to stress is that there is no shame in admitting that you've been taken with a quote-unquote bad idea, however that's defined. It's natural and normal for certain kinds of ideas to latch onto people's minds. A major thread running through these discussions is the acknowledgement of how easy it is for humans to be wrong about things, and that there doesn't have to be shame in realizing that. What I'm advocating is recognizing and learning to work with the realities of our brains. I'm a cult survivor, as I mentioned, and I've seen firsthand what kind of damage certain kinds of religious and quasi-religious belief, expression, and indoctrination can do. I will admit up front that I have somewhat of an anti-religious, or at least anti-Christian, anti-New Age bias. Hashtag not all Christians, of course. Despite that bias, it's also very important to me that people be able to express themselves spiritually or religiously in harmless or community-building ways. I'm very interested in understanding the religious impulse in humans and finding healthy ways to channel it. In my criticisms of religions, I'm going to be focusing on the specific types of religious expression that can cause harm, especially in situations where there is a difference of power. In my opinion, what you believe, while important, is not nearly as important as how you act, how you treat people around you. As you might hear often, result is more important than intent. In theory, I can perfectly coexist with believers, as long as they don't make their beliefs my or anyone else's problem. Disclaimers. On this point of atheism and the other topics I'm presenting along with it, I do want to make some big, glowing neon disclaimers up front, and I'm going to continue to make these. I'm defining atheism here as a lack of belief in gods, and not as the assertion there are no gods. As an agnostic, I can't say I know the answer to the God question, and I don't think I ever will. The first disclaimer is something I've mentioned already, which is that I see atheism as a viable option, not as a necessary conclusion. There are many, many, many different kinds of ways of believing in a deity, and it's not for me to say what is ultimately the most reasonable thing to believe in. Atheism is, for me, two things. It's a response to having been harmed by religion, and it's also a carefully considered philosophical position. Obviously, I think it's probably the right one when it comes to that one question, but as I've stressed and will stress again, nobody can be 100% sure about anything. I know enough about the limits of the human brain to know that there may be things about the cosmos that no human will ever understand. Second disclaimer is to acknowledge a pitfall I've fallen into and now want to talk about as part of this podcast, and perhaps help others to avoid that pitfall. Not all religions are the same. Not all sects within a religion are the same. There are definitely some similarities between religions of the world, and that's an interesting subject, but they are just as different from each other as they are similar, if not more so. There is massive disagreement within any religion as to how that religion is even defined, let alone differences in doctrine or values. When many atheists talk about religion, they will do so in very simplistic and counterproductive ways. They're often really just talking about the ugliest versions of Christianity. Many will also criticize Islam, but unfortunately, conversations about the very credible threat of Islamic theocracies are undermined by ignorant and often unfair criticisms of Islam as a whole or of Muslims as people. We in the U.S. are so utterly steeped in Christian and especially Puritan ethics and values that we unconsciously project Christianity onto other cultures and religions. Even unbelievers do this. You've probably heard the term Judeo-Christian before. You may or may not know that that doesn't mean anything, because even though Christianity plagiarized Jewish scriptures and mythology, they are not similar religions. They have very different goals. They operate utterly differently in societies and brains, and their relationship to their scripture and history is very, very different. People who say Judeo-Christian, at best, are probably trying to be inclusive, but they really just mean Christian, whether they realize it or not. If you're going to criticize any religion specifically, and do so effectively, and I would agree that every religion has some members in some sects that you would not invite over to dinner, you have to know something about it. You have to know how it operates in the minds of its adherents, what it means to them, and so forth. For that matter, you have to have compassion for its adherents because, often enough, the first victims of an oppressive religious order are its members, and criticizing a religion without cultivating empathy for its believers will backfire. Obviously, you can call out human rights abuses without knowing the details, but I'm talking more about responding to specific doctrines or practices. I actually remained a theist for a while longer than I might have because the first atheist books I read were aimed very much at mainstream Christianity. And at the time, I was involved in Krishna consciousness, which has a very different God conception that these various anti-Christian arguments didn't touch. Even though it was monotheistic, still there was a very different concept of God. I remember feeling superior for this reason. I could say I agreed with many of the arguments of popular atheist speakers because I agreed with them about the kind of harm that certain Christians, Muslims, and people of almost any other faith have definitely caused. But many atheist arguments, that includes arguments from atheists as well as arguments against the idea of a God, aren't persuasive or applicable to other religions outside Christianity. At this point now, of course, I've got plenty of arguments against the claims made by Krishna consciousness regarding the nature of God, souls, karma, what we should do with our lives, and so on. But that's because I have lived experiences with it. I have heard the doctrines talked about at length, and I understand, at least to a degree, how those beliefs operate in the minds of its believers, or at least in its Western believers. Religion and atheism are a touchy subject no matter where you go, but it's not controversial, I think, to notice that many, many people have been harmed on all levels of society by religious doctrines, religious leaders, and religious institutions. In talking about these subjects, my focus will always be on harm, preventing, reducing, and healing from harm. So to recap the episode so far, I have 3 loose trains of thought that I'm tying together. There is introspection, activism, and atheism, critical thinking, science, cults, etc. And then again, to recap, my disclaimers on the atheism subject are: 1, atheism is an option, not a necessary conclusion. 2, not all religions are the same. 3, my focus will always be on reducing harm. I want to try to draw these trains of thought together a little bit before I go on to some discussions. I'm doing this podcast because I believe that all of these aspects, that is, introspection, self-improvement, activism, organizing, critical thinking, countering predatory or high-control social groups, all of these complement each other, and I would venture often need each other. It's very hard to organize people who are hurting and or ignorant. At the same time, it's very hard to spend energy improving oneself or healing without a baseline of food, shelter, safety, healthcare, and community. And one can't effectively do anything political or personal without understanding how people think and feel, what influences our decisions. I believe that understanding the topics of how beliefs operate in individuals and groups is absolutely necessary to inner and outer change. Anytime you're dealing with human brains, including and especially your own, you need to know what you're dealing with if you want any success. Discussion number 1, the co-opting of introspection by the right wing. Activism focuses on outward political change, almost by definition. Activist goals tend to involve the elimination of some sort of glaring bias or oppression, by changing policies, swaying public opinion, and so on. Self-help, introspection, again, almost by definition, focus on inward change. It's a very broad and laden term that could mean many things. In some leftist eyes, it's the realm of the right wing. For example, Jordan Peterson is known for making fun of activists, outright denying certain types of systemic privilege that very obviously exist, and going so far as to tell people they're not qualified to try to change society unless they have first looked inward to some degree to his satisfaction. Now, I would agree with the idea that a person's actions out in the world will be more focused and effective if that person is healthier, more stable, more supported, less ignorant, and so forth. But this is extreme, and from my own perspective in self-improvement, quite toxic. Sometimes the real problem is out there. Sometimes introspection is impossible for reasons outside a person's control. This attitude acts as if there are no systemic problems, that all problems are just individual, as if there aren't communal solutions to our inner problems, as if there aren't political and systemic solutions to some of what plagues us as individuals. As someone born and raised in a very white, New Agey culture, I know from personal experience that a lot of introspective white folks are very privileged and sheltered, and they don't give a whole lot of thought to the struggles of marginalized people, and can often tend towards justifying the suffering in the world with strange metaphysical mental hoops. It can very easily lead to an over-individualistic mindset where the focus is entirely on one's own enlightenment or one's own process or their own karma or what have you. On another topic, there's also the huge commercial self-help industry. Now, I'm willing to grant that many of these folks are well-meaning, but the pitfalls are enormous. Much of the material focuses almost exclusively on the individual, often ignoring systemic problems and injustice, and often shunning communal solutions or not even acknowledging them. The attitude is usually something like, "You can do anything if you just think and do the right things," which is demonstrably not true for everyone. Some of these personalities will equate happiness with becoming more productive in the capitalist machine. Now, I'm not one to kink shame, but that really isn't it for a lot of people, honestly. Much of the weight loss industry takes advantage of the self-improvement impulse and preys upon people's insecurities. A lot of self-help gurus are just hucksters and grifters that do more harm than good, spreading platitudes that feel good but don't do anything long-term. A lot of them consciously or unconsciously focus on their own success, their own money, their own little pet theory of everything, their own ego gratification, all over the principles that they would like us to think they believe in. These famous self-help people will have a vested interest in the correctness of their own interpretations of the world and the usefulness of whatever it is they're selling. Unfortunately, a society that forces us to make money or starve is very conducive to charlatans, so we always have to be on our guard. I've seen what not being on your guard can do to a mind, and it's not pretty. I want to push back against the idea that self-help is just individualism or just navel-gazing fluff. Our culture kind of trains us to be terrible in a lot of ways, and it feels like most of us don't seem to survive childhood without some sort of trauma. If we want to live in a better world and leave a better one than we've found, it's incumbent upon us, the living, to unlearn those patterns, change human habits, work to integrate our trauma, and that requires us all to look inward. So summing up, I say, introspection doesn't have to be a right or a left thing. At its root, it's based on some basic human virtues that nearly everyone can acknowledge, I think. It's based on honesty, the desire to move away from ignorance, the courage to face down natural fears that come up when we try to be honest. No matter what your beliefs are, introspection and self-improvement are probably good for you, and therefore good for those around you. Discussion 2. Introspection is hard. Okay, so now that I've made the case that even you, can and should look inside and improve yourself, now I need to say that it's also really hard to do. Sometimes we'll hear phrases like, "Hey, it's not my job to educate you," or "do your research," or "do better." That's pithy, but it's a valid thing to say. The thing is, though, if people are to change their minds about things, they often need more than that. For example, we white folks have been asked to work to unlearn our deeply conditioned, unconscious racial biases. And I am all for that. It's very good for you. Some people who aren't used to it might ask, though, how? How do you do that? How exactly? What does the work look like? Well, I can't say for everyone, but I can say that it's uncomfortable. It's probably best done facilitated, and the person needs emotional support. And before even that can happen, the person has to be willing to confront ugly things within themselves that they probably didn't even choose. Discovering prejudices in yourself that you didn't want and don't agree with is painful. It's painful even if you know, on some level, that those prejudices are just societal conditioning and not your fault. Even if confronting them and changing them feels better in the long term, it's still hard. How does a person become ready and empowered to confront their biases? How do we catch ourselves in habits that we want to change? How do we learn to spot and manage our trauma triggers? How do we really heal? Is that even possible? How do we avoid doing harm? Every one of these questions could be studied for a lifetime, with much more to learn. It's hard. These are questions that I continue to ask myself all the time, and we need each other's support in these efforts. Discussion 3. Introspection and political change are necessary to each other. So, I've mentioned this a few times already. I talked about how inner and outer change can seem to be at odds with each other. This is such an important topic that I'm coming back to it again. I really want to see these two topics as intertwined. In order for political movements to be effective and coherent and create lasting change, in my opinion, the people involved need to be healthy and have their needs met. Humans need inordinate amounts of care, and when we don't get it, people fall apart, friendships and alliances fall apart, we fight over things that aren't the real issue, and any political power we might otherwise amass poofs away. Unprocessed and uncared for trauma turns us all into weapons, easy to divide and easy to exploit. On the other hand, people cannot be expected to do all the things necessary for introspection, healing, and growth when they're poor, starving, don't have access to health care, and so on. Folks like that need material help now, which requires political action now, action that can't wait for everyone to make progress in therapy or patch up their marriage, even if they can access therapy. A major component conspicuously missing from some self-help material, I think, is an acknowledgement that sometimes we can't help ourselves inwardly because we're barely holding it together outwardly. And without unconditional care from our communities, we will never be able to completely get it together, no matter how hard we visualize, no matter how much gumption we have, no matter how much personal responsibility we want and try to take. So these different pursuits seem to be in potential conflict for our time and energy. I want to ask and discuss how we can balance them, both as individuals and communities. What activities can work toward both intertwined goals of inner and outer change? How do you improve yourself while surviving in a late capitalist hellscape? Discussion 4. Down the new atheist rabbit hole and back. This discussion might feel like a bit of a tangent, and I might repeat myself a little bit, but I want to give you an idea of where I'm coming from and how my views have morphed over the years. One of the reasons I lost my God beliefs, actually, was because of the inner work I was continuing to do. From my perspective now, it was only a matter of time. I've always been passionately committed to discovering the truth, whatever that is, and since so many religious systems are based on legends and lies, many of them topple and fall under just a little bit of dispassionate scrutiny. I became an agnostic atheist through a long and natural process. I was anti-organized religion well before this, so I was already quite amenable to many of the arguments. As I mentioned, I was involved in Krishna consciousness. That was from about 2006 to 2009. And actually, almost all of that time was after I had gobbled up The End of Faith. Side note, if you haven't read The End of Faith, don't bother. I personally began my deconversion process around, it's hard to remember now, but it was around 2010 maybe, about the same time that I was drifting away from that group. I was still a theist, and I wanted to debate atheists. So I thought, if I'm going to argue with someone, I should know their position and hear their arguments. I also cared deeply about the human rights abuses committed by religious groups, as well as the many and constant church-state violations that happen in the U.S. So I started consuming more atheist and secularist material, and at some point, I found the arguments against gods, souls, and anything of the spirit world were actually convincing me. That wasn't my intention, but it happened. So, long story short, I got swept up in the new atheist train for a few years. It was quite exhilarating. The rush of liberation that comes with deconversion is hard to describe. That movement, as problematic as it was, brought to light many things that needed to be said about the sorts of threats and abuses that religious groups, religious governments, and religious indoctrination can pose, or how religion does not actually hold a monopoly on moral or ethical discussions, and is all too often the opposing force to real ethics based on human happiness. It was during this time that I became exposed to more and more material on the various subjects that I've mentioned, like logic, science, and critical thinking. In fact, the more I learned about science, the more I felt I was able to learn about myself. Introspection requires some loose application of the scientific method. We're trying to discover the truth through process of data collection, through thought experiment, real experiment, trying to uncover and compensate for our biases, changing our viewpoint in light of new information, and so forth. All of that meshes very well with looking inward. Unfortunately, many atheists forgot to keep applying critical thinking to their own brains. They decided they had arrived at being rational and correct, and whatever they believed was therefore rational and correct. They started doing things like making fun of feminists. Frankly, those people suck. Even granting that there's plenty of feminist theory worth critiquing, the folks I'm thinking about weren't really interested in that. They became interested in feeding their own ego, being mean to people, and stirring up outrage for clicks. Many Western atheists, as I've already mentioned, are actually just what I would call Christian atheists. They specifically don't believe in the Christian God, and are often quite ignorant of how other religions operate, all too eager just to paint all kinds of believers with the same brush. Now, I'm not saying you have to understand every religion to be a true atheist, at all. Of course not. But, as I've mentioned before, and will come back to, if you want to criticize specific religions, and avoid coming off as ignorant or bigoted, you have to know a lot about them. I have to admit my own errors in this regard. I've been called in and or out for this. Many sweeping statements about religion or religious people are unfair, inaccurate, or just downright nasty when applied to people with little or no political power, or people whose religion is very different. Many indigenous religions, for example, operate entirely different, fulfill different social functions, and most importantly, don't pose a threat to its practitioners or unbelievers in the way that, say, Christian, Islamic, or Hindu theocracies do. Or to use another example, just because Sylvia Browne is a hack doesn't mean that a native person can't commune with their ancestors in a way that's meaningful to them. Many atheists also retain a very quasi-Christian morality even if they've never believed. That is, this Puritan concept that we're all being individually judged for our actions, primarily for our intentions, based on some arcane and arbitrary moral code. For example, many secular people seem to act as if there's something morally wrong with promiscuous or kinky sex, intrinsically, separate from concerns like consent, STIs, trauma triggers, and other things that actually can complicate sex. In many secular minds, certain kinds of consensual adult sex are just bad or shameful, and the more of it you have, the worse of a person you are. Many people unwittingly focus more on being perceived as a good person, on being able to look good before an imaginary judge, rather than think about how their actions affect people. It is still very possible for secular and/or atheistic people to have dehumanizing views, ideological leftovers from their historically religious and suppressive culture, even if they individually mean well. I think one of the things I want to do here is basically to kind of take atheism back, as it were, and see it as one of many conversations about oppression, ignorance, and liberation. This ties in directly to both inner work, questioning what you believe, and outer work, eliminating religious oppression and abuse in the world. And for me, the focus isn't and cannot be, haha, you're silly for believing in a man in the sky. That's a non-starter. That's just being mean. It's also a straw man. Instead, I want to talk about the many ways that certain kinds of religious expression perpetrate harm. And for that matter, how harm can be propagated in similar ways that aren't explicitly religious. As I've said before, I want to change the narrative to presenting atheism not as an inevitable conclusion, but a valid and viable option, one that is no less moral than any religious system. I would maintain usually more moral. Atheist communities are, in theory, safer spaces for anyone questioning their beliefs. They're where someone can connect with former believers, hear arguments against whatever they were indoctrinated with, and start seeing the possibility of a world beyond belief. But you don't have to be an atheist to treat people with love, or to be in favor of secular humanist ethical systems, or to be in favor of flat organizational structures. And being an atheist does not in any way guarantee that you're correct on any other issue. To me, the number and nature of gods in the cosmos is a trivially easy question compared to what we should do in light of the answer. Or perhaps, more pointedly, what we should do when we don't agree on the answer. And if there's one thing we can agree on about gods, it's that we don't agree, and probably will not anytime soon. So, whatever your position is, if you smugly believe you've got the right answer to the God question, and all these rubes around you are misguided, don't let it go to your head. Conclusion. This podcast is not about converting or deconverting anyone or changing minds. It's more for me to express a lot of the ideas that I've been collecting. Ideas I think are worth repeating and analyzing, and hopefully expose myself to new perspectives in the process. Instead of changing minds, I insist that only you can and should change your own mind. I'm here to help you think about things from a new perspective, if that's what you want. I'm here to empower you to discover new perspectives for yourself. I'm here to encourage you to think about things you're not used to thinking about, or maybe thinking about things that make you a little uncomfortable but might benefit you in the long run. So, that's it for this episode. I hope you liked it. I gave it a lot of thought. I have a couple people to thank. I want to thank Ariel Alon for her feedback on the first draft of this script. She was the one who first used the term ideological immune system with me, and I thought it was genius. I want to thank my sibling, River Bradley. They gave me some feedback on the script as well. Very grateful. I am hoping to make future episodes of this a bit more collaborative. I want to be talking with people about these subjects. So if I know you and you're interested in this sort of thing and you maybe want to be a guest or a co-host with me, please drop me a line. I can't guarantee anything. I can't even guarantee how often I'll be able to produce these episodes, but still, if you're interested in being involved on some level, please let me know somehow. The last thing I'll say is that the title of this podcast...
Who am us anyway?
It's a reference. If you can get the reference, good for you. You're probably in my parents' generation. If not, hopefully it will still make sense. Thanks for listening, and you are worthy of love.